set up my PowerPoint so you can see that.
Right. Before you keep going, for questions, do you want to save them to the end, or you want me to interrupt if someone puts them in the chat and it's appropriate to do so, or you just...
Yeah, so I'll have a time period at the end for questions, but if there's an appropriate question that needs to be answered during the presentation, you can alert me to that in chat as well.
All right, sounds good.
All right. So welcome, everyone. Thanks for coming to the presentation today. This talk is on decoding the disciplines, particularly on using interviews to surface tacit knowledge in both instructors and students. So I'm Jared McBrady. I'm an assistant professor of history here at SUNY Cortland, where I primarily teach in our social studies teaching program. And I'm joined today by two of our upper level students in that program who have worked with me on this project on using decoding interviews to surface tacit knowledge. So I'll let them introduce themselves briefly as well.
Hello, everyone. My name is Luke Lassiter. As Dr. McBrady said, I'm a social studies education major with history and planning on student teaching in the spring and looking forward to getting into the field of social studies education.
Hi, everyone. I'm Andrew Miller. I'm also a social studies teaching and education major. I'm a senior at Cortland, and I'm also student teaching in the fall.
All right. So we're talking today about this term bottlenecks. It comes from a metaphor with traffic jams, right? You have a bottleneck that prevents vehicles to progress forward. It stops them up. It keeps them from moving forward. And this is a teaching problem as well. There are points in teaching where students seem to get stuck, where they experience something that prevents them from moving forward. And the problem often is, as a teacher, I see my students struggle with something that's so natural for me, so instinctual, something I've done so many times that I'm unsure of how to teach my students how to move forward. I'm sure all of you have experienced this as well. An example from my own practice, and these two students who have me in class will recognize that, determining what we have of language demands in a lesson. What constitutes a discourse language demand, what constitutes a vocabulary language demand, what constitutes a function language demand. That's one bottleneck that I can do very well. I can do quite naturally. And so I have to struggle with how to get students to do that. Another one that I experience is looking at state standards and determining what content needs to go into a lesson. What's more important, what needs to be emphasized, what's less important, what doesn't get included in the lesson entirely. So I'm sure you all experience similar things that are natural to you, but you struggle to teach to your students. And I'm going to ask you right now to just stop and think about what's a particular bottleneck that your students face in your teaching. This is going to be important because we're going to practice decoding that in a little bit. But I want to start with just as you're listening, think to yourself, what is something in my teaching that students seem to get stuck? What's that bottleneck? And so I'm talking today about a potential solution to this problem of bottlenecks. It's a paradigm called Decoding the Disciplines. It was developed at Indiana University. It came out of what they called the Freshman Learning Project. It was a bunch of professors who were in a learning group trying to understand the experiences of their first-year students. And so professors visited each other's classes and observed each other teach. And so they were observing teaching that was happening out of their own fields of expertise. And so that they realized as they were doing that, that something that those professors, the teachers were doing came naturally to them, came tacitly to them, but it wasn't explicit to the learners. The learners were confused. Even those particular learners who were observers, who held advanced degrees, PhDs, because their training was in a different field, they as students were also confused. And so the task became, how do you decode that expert disciplinary thought? How do you take thought that is tacit, that's natural, that's instinctual for us who've been doing it for a long time because we've practiced it for many years, we've studied intensely in it, and how do we decode it into explicit steps for the purposes of teaching? And so the team at IU came up with 7 stages to this. We're going to focus in particular on stage 2 today, but I want to give you a big picture of all those stages. So the first stage is just identifying bottlenecks. What is a bottleneck to learning in the class? What are the places where students get stuck? And then your stage 2 is then you have to decode disciplinary thought. That is, you as an expert need to figure out, how do you do the tasks associated with working through the bottleneck? Not necessarily how you teach them, but how do you do it yourself? And that's going to be the focus of today. Once you've figured that out, you've decoded it, you move on to stage 3, stage 4, stage 5, and stage 6, which is the teaching parts. In stage 3, you think about, how do I model what I do to my students? How do I show that to them? And then in stage 4, how do I plan experiences where they can then practice doing those skills? Stage 5, how do I motivate students? How do I get them to buy in that it's actually worthwhile doing these skills? Stage 6, how do I assess whether my students have actually learned how to do this? And then stage 7, of course, is if you've encountered a bottleneck in your teaching, it's likely that other members of your profession have experienced similar bottlenecks. And if you figure out a good way to decode it and to teach students it, you've got a professional responsibility to share those results with others, disseminate what you found. So again, we're focusing on stage 2, and a particular tool for decoding disciplinary thought is what's called the decoding interview. So Luke and Andrew have both trained in that. They've both completed decoding interviews, both with interviewing, practicing other teachers in their program, and then interviewing students on surface disciplinary thought. And so they're going to demonstrate in a second, and then you're going to get a chance to practice doing a decoding interview in groups here in this session. So I wonder, Chris, if you want to put the handout I emailed into the chat now, that might be a good time to do it so that they have that available when it's their turn to practice doing a decoding interview.
Okay, just gonna give me a minute.
Perfect. But first, the question is, what is a decoding interview? And as I was teaching this with our teacher candidates in the program, a great analogy came out of that, which is one student said, it's like being a toddler, always asking why. And I like that analogy because a 3-year-old doesn't know much about the world. And so that 3-year-old asks his or her parents the question of why a lot in order to better understand the world. And interviews work in the same way, but they are primarily beneficial to the expert interviewee. So that is, the point of these interviews is to force the interviewee to turn their expert tacit knowledge into something that's explicit, that's clearly voiced. And so an interviewer that assumes no knowledge in the discipline and pushes the interviewee to constantly explain how and why does a good job of helping that interviewee decode their own expert knowledge. So that's why often in decoding research, you try to find an interviewer or two who are outside of your own discipline if you want to be interviewed. If you have someone in your own discipline, it can be easy to slip into jargon that's unexplained or shared assumptions that you both have or both know. But being interviewed by someone outside of your discipline means you can't do that. So a couple points that might help you on the interview, and this is also going to be in what's going to be shared in the chat. So steps in an interview is, first, ask interviewees to start from a specific recent example of when they use that mental action. Ask them to narrate what do they do when they're thinking through that. Imagine yourself doing what the interviewee describes. And as you imagine doing it, are there steps being left out that they haven't told you? And if they haven't told you, follow up and ask them about those steps. Pay attention to confusion. So ask questions if you don't understand. Probe if the interviewee cannot explain it. Probe those points. That's usually a point where they're getting at tacit knowledge that they haven't fully voiced. And that might be a point where your students are getting confused as well. So summarize what the interviewee is saying, restate their points, and then going along with confusion, reassure interviewees that it's okay to not be able to explain clearly their tacit knowledge. You might experience, if you're an interviewee later on, struggle to put it into words, and that's fine. That's what these are for. And the last point, gently redirect. So as professors and teachers, we often are, when interviewed, like to jump from explaining how we do something just straight into teaching it, like we would teach a student. That's not the point of that. So if you leap into explanation, the interviewer leaps into explanations of how they would teach it, how they have taught it, how they learn it, redirect them. Because the question is not, how do you teach it? It's how do you yourself do this type of thinking? So some key points in that: confusion. Confusion is a good thing. So if you're an interviewer and you're confused, don't pretend you understand it or skip over to the parts where it makes sense. That's exactly the point where you need to ask probing questions, try to reveal the assumptions that the interview has skipped over. Avoid being sidetracked by those digressions and redirect if you can. Pay attention to the interviewee's comfort level. So you want to be reassuring and provide reassurance as they get frustrated or uncomfortable, but you want to probe that area, because the point where the interviewee is struggling to explain his or her thinking, that's exactly the point you want to decode, because that's going to help them teach it better. And the last thing is working through silence. So rephrasing questions, asking different questions can help with that. And so the handout has some suggested ways that you might rephrase or ask additional questions to work through silence. So what we're going to do next is Luke and Andrew are going to demonstrate for us a decoding interview. They're going to interview, one's going to interview the other. And one area of a common bottleneck for students that our social studies teachers have experienced is students working with the historical thinking skill of contextualization. How do you put something into its historical context, which is actually a pretty advanced disciplinary mode of thinking. So that's the topic for this interview. And they're not going to do a full interview, but they're going to take about 10 minutes to show for us how you might go about doing that interview. So I'm going to mute myself, stop sharing, and turn it over to them to demonstrate for us this interview.
Hi, everyone.
Hello.
I will be the interviewer, and Luke is going to be the interviewee. And we're going to start. So, Luke, what is contextualization?
So contextualization to me is a historical thinking skill that will allow me to give myself a better understanding of surrounding factors that might influence the source or the text being used.
Okay, so what are some of those surrounding factors?
Some surrounding factors that may influence the text that I would be looking for would definitely be the time period of when the text was written, or where it was written in regard to the geographic location.
Okay. Now, if you were handed a source, what would be your process of contextualization?
Well, the first thing I do when close reading and annotating my source would be to look for the author's perspective. I can do this through seeing if in any statements the author expresses his or her opinion. After doing that and contextualizing what the author is thinking, I can look for the intended audience. So who the author is trying to address here. After that, I can try and build some of my own connections with some of the tacit knowledge I have myself, if I can make any.
Okay. So why would that be significant when going over a source? So why would knowing the author's perspective be significant?
Because once I have a better understanding of the surrounding factors, like you said, what the author's perspective is, I can build connections across history through concepts, and I can that I've been observing. One concept that I could be looking for is change over time.
Okay, that's good that you brought up concepts. So if contextualization is one skill, what is another skill that coincides with it?
One that I would pair with contextualization would probably be analysis.
All right, so why would you use the skill of analysis?
Well, analysis allows me to break down the text into smaller and more detailed parts. This gives me a better understanding of the context and perspectives because it's more refined.
Okay, and can you contextualize all sources?
Well, what do you mean by that? Can you rephrase that?
Yeah, so can you apply contextualization to only primary sources, only secondary sources, or both sources?
You can definitely apply that to both sources because at the end of the day, regardless of the author, you are trying to break down that perspective as well as the intended audience.
Okay, and lastly, can this skill or can contextualization translate across different majors, do you think?
I would have to say absolutely. This would translate across every other field, because regardless of the subject of the text or the source, you are going to be looking for surrounding connections and relationships you're trying to tie together. Each subject area has concepts that you can draw upon.
Okay, and what would be an example of another field that you could use this skill of contextualization?
One that comes to mind would probably be English language arts. When teachers are working with students on like a novel, you could be trying to get a better understanding of what the author's trying to convey. And so you would do that by getting the context. So who was this author? You know, maybe where did he write it and when?
That's good. And that is the end of the interview.
So one of the things you saw there is Luke started throwing out some jargon. Andrew unpacked some of that. You know, why? So you said perspective. What do we mean by perspective? What's the significance of looking at author's perspective? Unfortunately, these two also know that jargon very well. So they are having a little bit of sharing that. If they had more time, I would have them unpack it even further. But pressing for how do you do this when you have a source? And Luke did a good job of not trying to teach someone how to do it, but just explaining how he was doing it himself. So that's part of what you're going to do here. I think when you're paired up, you're going to have hopefully people that are outside of your discipline that might not know the words at all that you're using. That's actually going to be a good thing to have, someone who doesn't have that familiarity. And so that pressing on, that asking follow-up questions, asking why you're doing that, what's the significance of doing that step, is a good way to go about doing that. So what we're going to do next is we're going to have some breakout rooms. You've got either, I think, online, and then maybe also in the chat, there is that handout with the questions you might ask. And so what we're going to have you do is, you know, introduce yourself, and then just practice using these interview techniques. Practice talking with someone about what is the bottleneck you want to work on, and then have someone hopefully outside of your own discipline interview you. If you complete one interview, I think we can have about 30 minutes of time for this. If you can complete one interview, switch roles and then tackle the next bottleneck in there. But get some practice at being pushed on your thinking, working through confusion, and really surfacing and trying to make explicit some of that. So I had a question on where the handout is. It is on the there. Thank you, Chris.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah. For some reason, the file attachment sharing thing is not activated on my Zoom account, but you should be able to access it at that Google Doc.
All right. And so I think, can we set up breakout rooms?
Yeah.
Rooms
So
now?
just a couple of things, Jared. So we've been learning this week how breakup rooms tend to work in these sessions and tend not to work. And I will say that, you know, I'm not going to call anybody out here, but you know, with these conferences, it seems like there's some people that just kind of log on and maybe doing other things and don't necessarily join the breakout. So I know you said you wanted rooms of 2. I would recommend maybe rooms of 4, and that way you'll get hopefully at least 2 people that are active. And you said you wanted a half an hour. Do you think? I mean, that seems like a lot of time, but you know, happy to give everybody that amount of time if you think that that's what's necessary.
Yeah, I mean, if we have groups of 4, we should be able to get through more than one interview in that time period. So I think that's fine. Yeah.
All right. So yeah, if you really don't want to join a breakout, you know, you're welcome to stay on, but it would make things go a lot easier if you sort of jump out now and jump back in a half an hour out of it, because then I won't include you in one of the breakouts and you won't be, because it's always a little awkward to be in a breakout room and you're by yourself and there's like 3 other people in there who are not there. So I'm going to give everybody a minute to sort of, you know, if you'd like to participate in the breakouts, we want to have you, But if you really know that you're definitely not going to participate in the breakout, feel free to boogie on out now. And then, you come log back in about 30 minutes and you can hear what everyone has to say. So, okay, we're getting some. All right. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to create 5 rooms, and Jared, you and Andrew and I'm sorry, I'm forgetting his name's not there. Do you guys want to join the breakouts, or do you want to just stay in the main room? Or I mean, I could assign you, I could move you around.
I mean, I'm happy. We can stay in the main room, and maybe if anyone is there a way to summon one of us if there's questions?
I believe there is. I mean, I could push out messages too, but I could actually put you in. We can float around if we have to.
Okay, that sounds great.
Do you guys want to be in a room with anybody just to kind of peek in? You don't have to.
We're fine with whatever. So whatever works best for you.
All right, let's keep you in the main room for now, and then we can talk afterwards. So, all right. So it looks like we've got 22 plus the 3 of us. So I'm going to create 5 rooms. All right. So, and I'm going to do it automatically. So you guys will get invited to join a room, but you don't have to enjoy it. So, okay, one last call. If anybody doesn't really want to do the breakouts, if you could jump out of the session now and come back in a half an hour, that'll make our lives a lot easier. All right, so we're going to do 30 minutes, and I will definitely give you all at least a 5-minute warning in the chat, and we're opening the rooms now. So anybody, if you're still in the main room, please join your breakout room, or if you're not going to be doing that, maybe log out of the Zoom and then log back in about 25, 30 minutes. Okay, so it looks like we have, hey guys, I'm going to stick you in breakout room 1 if you don't mind. You cool with that? All right. I have to move you there though. Hang on a sec. And I think, all right, so let's set the timer.
I do that all the time with my classes.
I'll have to get the closed caption back up too. Oh, jeez.
And I wonder, I'm not seeing a screen share up. Oh, there it is. Now it's back. All right. Are we ready to resume, Chris?
Yeah, I don't know why the closed captions stopped, but just go ahead and I'll try to get
Okay.
going back up.
So and you got a taste of practicing that. I think you'll see it's not easy. I know I'm a historian. We were asking questions about computer programming. It's very outside of my field. And that's good. And it was good that it was hard and that there was confusion how to do it, because if that's why your students are getting confused, right? Because it's natural to you. And you have to work at transitioning what is natural and easy and intuitive into something that works for someone who doesn't find it natural, easy, and intuitive. And so this is a practice that can be done over and over again. It's a practice that you can also kind of do to yourself, although it's harder to do to yourself, to self-interview and decode yourself, because again, it's easy. That's part of the problem. So I just want to talk a little bit about how I use this in my teaching. So I'm in teacher education, and how we use that. So I had a research project. We did it last semester. I was teaching 2 courses at the time, more than 2 courses, but these are the 2 courses in the project. A social studies professional preparation course for our social studies teachers, and a world history survey course. And so what happened was, there was a couple things that were going on. So my social studies teachers learned the decoding interview, and they practiced decoding their own thoughts. They interviewed each other with this question: how do you select credible sources for your history assignments? They're history majors, they're advanced history majors. They've done a lot of this, they've studied a lot. And so they've written a lot of papers in history, and they know how to find good sources for that. At the same time, I had my world history students, who is a GE course, a survey course. We're doing, for many of them, what might be their first history assignment since high school. A primary source analysis. They're comparing and contextualizing 2 sources. And so they were working on this project. The students in red here, the students in blue, were practicing how to decode, and they were learning with each other. And they were working on making that more explicit, how they were decoding, how they were selecting sources, how do they weigh something as credible or not credible. They were putting what was natural into words. And then I had the teachers then interview the world history students. And so this is slightly different than what we did, right? Because the expert was the interviewee there. But now the expert has been interviewed, and the expert kind of has decoded, what are the steps that I need to take to do this work? What are the steps that I need to take to select credible sources? And so this was a conversation that these teachers then had with these world history students. How did you select the sources for your history assignments? And so this is an innovation decoding that comes from Rouse and colleagues. They were working in political science, so they interviewed professors, and then they went and interviewed students in political science. And then they found out a couple of things. I mean, one, the teachers reflected on their own disciplinary thought, right? They were better able to explain, what does it mean to select and use a credible source? How do you evaluate sources for history papers? But they were also encountering some things that their students were doing, and the gaps that weren't glaring before became gaps now. They started to identify more explicit what the bottlenecks are, and also what folkways are. So students had figured out ways of getting by that the professor was missing. So students were doing things like, oh, I know I need to go to a .edu or a .gov, but they don't really know why they avoid .com, or why that rule of thumb isn't always perfect, right? There are certain things you can't use from .edu, even if they have that ending. There's certain things that, even though it's got a .com ending, could be a good source to use. But they were navigating that. And so you might not have seen that on a paper, but by talking to the students, you were able to work with what were those folkways that maybe didn't show up in the paper you were grading, but were going to become problematic later. And so they developed what Sunshine calls a theory of mind for their students. My teachers, after decoding their own disciplinary thought, were then able to say, all right, but this is how my students are thinking about it. And these are the things that are serving them well in terms of this thought. And these are the assumptions that they're making that are going to be problematic. They also picked up this idea of words as mind tools. My teacher candidates have a number of words, vocab words that they know and that they understand that's connected with history, contextualization, perspective, sourcing, and that they found that the students who were able to explicitly use and define those words were able to better do that work than the students who couldn't define those words. So those words became tools for students. And so this, like I said, this was just a brief project I did in conjunction with two of my classes working with decoding. I'm happy to talk more about the findings or about decoding in general, but I want to turn it over now in the end to a Q&A. And I guess, Chris, I don't know how you want to moderate the Q&A section.
I mean, we have a small enough group that if folks just want to kind of open up their mic, I think we can do that. Deacon had a comment in the chat. So anybody have questions or thoughts, or anybody want to kind of talk about their experience in the breakout room doing this activity? Ria asks, can you explain mind tools more?
All right. So mind tools in history, that comes from the work of Bob Bain. It's a tool, but not a tool in a physical sense. It's a tool that's useful for thinking. So we all have mind tools that we use, and oftentimes it's jargon. So when I talk about contextualization or perspective as a historian, I can use that to know what I'm supposed to do with a source because I know what that tool is. But when I just say that word to students, it's not a mind tool, right? Because they don't know what it means or what to do with it. They don't unpack that more. So in a sense, you might think of it as a metaphor. Metaphors are an example of mind tools. But it's this idea of once you know what that word means, it gives you a tool to describe what you're doing and how you're doing it. And I can continue to give more examples for history, but I know that there are mind tools in other disciplines as well that I'm not familiar with. But once I have what that concept means, what that word means, what skills or questions that word describes, then all of a sudden I know, oh, I should be sourcing this document. Once I know that mind tool, I can do that action. Whereas before, I didn't have the language to describe that. But having that language and unpacking what that language means to you as an expert for your students helps open up that mind tools to them. All right. This looks like I'm opening the chat here as well.
Your thoughts, comments? Again, feel free to jump in with your mic if you want.
Yeah. So Dakin's got a question about heuristics and more robust ones. So yeah, the students had a heuristic, a mental shortcut, the world history students, that was leading to success in terms of their grades, right? They were going to .edu and .gov sources, and I was not dinging them on their papers for using sources that weren't credible. But they weren't robust heuristics because they didn't know why that's where you went to get good sources. They just knew that, all right, if I go to .gov or .edu, Dr. McBrady is not going to write a comment on my paper on the citation. And so interviewing them about why they did that helped our social studies teachers realize, oh, this is why you're doing it. You're doing it because you just think this is how to get the grade. And I thought you were doing it because you understood what it means to be a credible source. And so that interview with students opened up a new ability to help give them heuristics, give them mental shortcuts that are going to help them do the work of history, but do it appropriately. And not in, like Dakin says, that brittle heuristic versus robust heuristic. Yeah.
Hi, this is Roberta. How do you introduce the interview during the course? In the middle of the semester, now you realize that students have problems, so you want to interview them. How do we, and it's not in your syllabus, so
yeah.
How do you approach the interview, especially online, like when you don't have a face-to-face interaction?
So there's a couple of ways to go about doing it, particularly when you're working with students, right? You're going to interview a formal interview with you and a peer to figure out really what is the thinking that's going on when you're interviewing experts. When you modify it to work with students in your class, then it becomes, it might not be a formal interview, but it can be a question. So as I had them write their paper, in addition to writing their paper, then they had to follow up with, tell me why you chose the sources you did, right? So that's a mini interview, right? That question and that assignment is a mini way to decode their thinking. And you can say, if all they say is, I chose them because I know .gov and .edu are important, then I know there's more work for me to do as a teacher. But if they say, I evaluated this source using this criteria and I figured it was credible, that also lets me know, that it's a more robust heuristic, not a brittle one. And if I've already interviewed myself to know how I determine what makes the source credible, I can look for that same thing in what my students are doing. So questions where students are reflective or metacognitive, are talking about why they're doing what they're doing, where you use the same type of questions you might ask in these decoding interviews we just practiced of your students, even if it's not a 15 or 30-minute interview you're doing with them, you can do parts of that to kind of surface what are their thoughts, what are their tacit thinking about this, can they make it explicit? And then you can evaluate, is their explicit thinking a robust heuristic or a brittle heuristic?
Perfect. Thank you.
And so kind of to follow up on that, I will frequently with my students, they have to do the thing, and then they have to explain or justify why it is that they're doing the thing. So if they're writing a lesson, write your lesson, explain and tell me why this is a good lesson. What was your thinking behind it? And that sort of explanation, justification as a written assignment, as an informal discussion in class, all ways that you can incorporate decoding into your work with students.
Yes, makes sense.
I have an interesting bottleneck in the course I teach. I teach Introduction to Liberal Studies. It's an online class. I've taught it for about 5 years now. And the bottleneck in my class is that students have a difficult time understanding that there are different sort of clusters of disciplines. So understanding what the humanities are and the social sciences, natural sciences, and fine arts are the four from the class. And so I've just, there are books out there that talk about this, but I really I try to get them to sort of read examples, and then they have to complete a paper where they choose two of the clusters and then do some research and find articles. And I have that, I try to have those metacognitive questions where they're talking about how, the unique perspective of the discipline, sheds light on, the topic that they're researching. And for many of my students, just that language just goes whoosh, right over their head. So I've struggled with, how to approach it, just because, in many ways it's, most issues are interdisciplinary. So you're introducing sort of these somewhat arbitrary distinctions to do research, because that's what we do, right? But then, so it's really interesting to see how they struggle with it. And I'm always trying to figure out how could I, decode disciplinary thinking in general, right? It's kind of a meta problem.
And because you're looking across disciplines, right? It's not even within my own discipline how to decode thinking, but you're
Right.
doing what is something that is very natural for us in higher education, which is like Yeah, I know disciplines take different approaches to things. Like, so my field, I refer to myself jokingly as bilingual, right? Because I work in history and I work in education, and how I speak and what I say sometimes code switches, right? Depending on what conference I go to, I'll present the same material with a completely different set of vocabulary. How do I know how to do that? And how do I learn about and understand how disciplines are different? That's pretty sophisticated thinking that you and I are doing naturally, automatically, right? I mean, even in faculty meetings, if someone from a department says something, you're already assuming like, well, they're coming at it from this perspective because they're in the biology department, and we're going to think about it completely different here. So that's almost the task to decode. How is it that you take your knowledge of what a discipline does to predict how to apply it to a situation, whatever the situation is, right? Because it sounded like you were, how do disciplines look at something from different angles? And so that's worth being interviewed. How do you do that, Chris? You know, how do you, when you sit down and say, all right, I know this about this cluster of disciplines, and that's going to lead to that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I hadn't really thought of it that way, you know. But what I end up telling them, and I'm not necessarily answering your question, is, you know, right now they're doing their bibliographies, their annotated bibliographies for their research project, and they often want to know how do I know if this is humanities or if this is social science? And I usually say, well, you know, what journal did you get it from, and where are the authors? What department did they teach in? And then I can tell you. But I feel like that's a shortcut that, you know, I have to use because it's a one semester class. But I would love to have something, you know, more, I guess, profound to say, well, people in the humanities and I give them examples, right, for each of them, but there's only one example of all of humanities, right? You know, so like, the one example isn't going to cut it. So I have to teach them those shortcuts, and yeah, so that's a good question. I don't know the answer to your question, but I need to think about that. So any other questions? Any other bottlenecks that anybody has in their classes that they want to address before we finish today? I love this approach, by the way. I've been to sessions at various conferences with the folks that came up with the Decoding the Disciplines. Leah Shopko was at Brockport a few years ago. It was probably like 15 years ago now, geez. And did a workshop for our faculty there, and it was fantastic.
It's not discipline based, but I think it might be helpful doing some version of this with students regarding online learning in general. Some of the preconceptions, like I'm thinking taking a class online will be easier, even though experience has shown most students that's not the case, but kind of trying to figure out why, what are people getting stuck on when it comes to online teaching and learning.
How is it, yeah, and this is something I found with the switch to online. How is it that how I have my LMS set up is so intuitive to me, but not intuitive to someone else? And how do I navigate, you know, what is tacit knowledge? Well, of course I'm going to go here to find the assignments to turn in. Of course I'm going to go here for the due dates and deadlines. And how do you turn that into explicit knowledge for your students? Something I've had to work on a lot more. It was a crash course in the last semester, and then this semester trying to be a bit more deliberate about it because I know it's happening. But even this semester, I collected some mid-semester feedback, and one of the things students asked for were, you know, more clarity on deadlines. And I'm thinking, it's in my syllabus. Every deadline is in my syllabus. Everything is set up on a to-do list in the LMS. And so the question becomes, well, of course, naturally, I know you look in the syllabus to find deadlines. Naturally, I know you look at this part, this LMS that I designed in the deadlines, but it wasn't natural to them. So that was, I mean, a mini decoding moment when I got that feedback.
Yeah.
How do I make
that?
Yeah.
That reminds me, it came up in our breakout session too, that if we're using this tool right now, we have to take into account the unique circumstances we're in. And so like that one that you just mentioned, it's about LMS, it's about previous knowledge, but it's also about their cognitive overload.
Yeah.
And that the world is on fire, so it's harder to remember deadlines, even when they're in huge letters in red, pulsating on the screen.
And the other thing, so Joan Middendorf and Leah Shopko have done nice work on bottlenecks that aren't cognitive, bottlenecks that are emotional. I know, history has emotional bottlenecks, particularly if you've experienced the world from one viewpoint, and then all of a sudden you're plopped in and have to consider a viewpoint that's diametrically and very emotionally charged difference from you. That's a bottleneck. It's not a cognitive bottleneck per se, but it's a bottleneck that we've all worked through and we can do naturally. And students, sometimes better than others, but students have more struggle working through that emotional bottleneck. So I think that's a good point, that these bottlenecks aren't just in the cognitive disciplinary thinking domain, but there's emotional ones. There's, technological bottlenecks. There's other places where students get stuck in your class.
So we got a couple more minutes. Anybody else want to jump in?
I'll add one thing.
Deacon,
And that's
yeah.
when Jared brought up emotional bottlenecks, it reminded me of Craig Nelson, who taught in history, or sorry, in biology. And he ran into one of those every semester because this was in Indiana. There were a lot of folks that believed in creationism. And then they would come into his biology class where he's trying to teach evolution and trying to get people to set aside their personal beliefs for a short time so you can view that academically. That was probably one of the biggest things he dealt with in some of his early classes.
Yeah, and I would say that's definitely, that's something that we as academics have learned how to do, right? How do you set aside a personal viewpoint or a personal belief to examine something outside of that? What are the steps to doing that? What do we go through? What are the tacit things that we do that enable us to do that? How do you train a student to do the same thing? I mean, that's something that definitely is worth decoding in yourself. What are the things that you did to be able to do that? How does your student do the same? Even that knowledge of like setting aside personal viewpoints, like that's a word tool, like, right? That I have a viewpoint, I can set it to the side and examine something from outside of it. That doesn't mean I've abandoned this. It just means I'm examining it with that. That's a kind of a comforting mind tool to think that's a skill I can do. That doesn't make me abandon this that's important to me. I'm just setting it aside and examining outside of it for a little bit.
Yeah, and even that understanding, you don't have to change your mind, you just have to consider other viewpoints. That can be difficult for people to understand. I've had at least one student who at the end of the semester suddenly realized he could have been arguing with me the whole semester. And suddenly it became, what? I could actually talk about that? And it's like, yeah, please do in your future classes, express your mind.
We've had, this method reminds me a lot of, it's sort of a flip side or a complement to being critically reflective, right, about your teaching and your students' learning, and we had a presentation the other day on using critical reflection to improve your teaching. I mean, just that kind of idea of trying to uncover hidden assumptions that you have. I think we're going to need all these tools in the next month or so to make sure that we're checking our own assumptions and helping students work through theirs as well. So. Thank you, Jared. Thank you, Luke. Thank you, Andrew. I thought this is a fantastic session. I really appreciate, you making it interactive, and well done, gentlemen. Thanks so much.
Yeah.
All right, so we are going to transition to the final set of presentations. I see Marissa's here already, but we have a 15-minute break. I certainly need it, and I'm guessing all of you need a little break as well. So let's do that, and we'll return in 15 minutes.